gladly lay down his life for one sibling or 8 second cousins.
Male orgasms may reduce lifespan or shorten health span.
Then they are more likely to breed with close relatives. It's that bad. It's that bad.
Development. Sexual development.
Josh Mittledorf.
Mikhail Bogosklonny.
Cynthia Kenyon.
Vladimir Dillman.
Tom Johnson.
Robert Schmuckler-Rees.
J.B.S. Haldane.
David Sinclair.
John
Gurdon. Aging is programmed.
It would be terribly wonderful if aging were programmed.
Aging is an adaptation.
How surprising was that?
Epigenetics, actually the key driver of aging.
Whoa. I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah.
It is rather easy to evolve longer lifespans, starting from a short lifespan situation. I really want to see that done.
Fantastic.
Well, we're in agreement.
Okay.
Monarch butterflies. My favorite example, rockfishes, right? They vary in lifespan from like 12 years to 200 years.
Your mileage may vary.
There's just so many different species who are certainly programmed to die, like mostly insects and plants.
But what are they doing with that energy that they save by not maintaining their bodies? They're reproducing. Absolutely. There is a trade-off between reproduction and maintenance.
There's parasites that, take advantage of that. They infect worker ants and actually make them live as long as queens.
Yeah,
and there's no trade-off. They don't need to reproduce, and they can still live. And queens reproduce like crazy, and they live the longest. And
Semmelparity and famine, for example. This is clearly a programmed aging thing.
If programmed aging is the correct hypothesis, then some approaches just never going to work. Like even replacement might not work, because if your brain is controlling your aging and you put old brain in a new body, the old brain will just quickly tell the new body that it's as old as the old body was.
100%. Experiment that needs to be done of heterochronic whole body transplantation is absolutely critical. If we look through the tree of life, we do not see any Semmelparous species that has survived for very long.
What about insects and plants? I think most of them are...
Well, so we don't see Semmelparity there.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective.
It's worse than that. It's worse. I'm not done. What the hell do you expect? Honestly, I have no words.
Very contentious.
They wanted a debate. Let's give them a debate.
Okay, so let's get started. So we're going to be talking about theories of aging today, and I think the panelists here have slightly different interpretations of what's going on with aging, and we're going to dig into it and make them fight it out on stage in public. So let's get started. So maybe Aubrey and Yuri, you guys can just start with kind of like your opening statement about what you think, short, just like one sentence, what you think is going on in aging, what fundamentally is going on in aging.
All right, so I think it's useful to start by classifying theories of aging a little bit. So, first of all, there are some theories of aging that are all about why aging exists. These are evolutionary theories, basically. They say, aging exists because it's bad, because it's not bad enough for you for evolution to have done anything about it. They say, aging exists because it's good for the species, even if it's not good for the individual, things like that. Most of the field has definitely, given up talking about that. They've basically said, okay, for whatever reason, aging exists. We really don't care about whether aging is good for you as a species, because even if it is, that doesn't impinge on what we can do medically. So, really what we actually care about is not why aging exists, it's how aging works. Then we can classify a little bit further in how aging works. We can say, do we care about the molecular and cellular level of it, or and slowing it down, or do we care about what it results in, how to fix it? And I spoke about that this morning, of course. I think that if we're going to talk about theories of aging today, we need to talk about mechanisms, about what really drives aging. So the final thing I want to say in kind of setting the context from my point of view is the difference between what I'm going to call strong theories of aging and weak theories of aging. So a strong theory of aging is the hypothesis that a particular mechanism of aging dominates, that it essentially, determines and dictates the chronological age at which a given species is typically going to get sick. Whereas a weak theory of aging says that such and such a mechanism contributes, maybe as a minor contributor, to that thing, to the chronological age at which an individual gets sick. And for a very, very long time, it has been essentially universally agreed by experts that all strong theories of aging are wrong, and that all weak theories of, an awful lot of weak theories of aging are correct. In other words, that there are many mechanisms that contribute, that none of those mechanisms outweighs all the others, and here we are. We've just got to get on with it. Now, what that has led to in terms of the way experts describe theories of aging is that it's gone out of fashion. You don't often see people talking about theories of aging. So I was very surprised a few years ago when my friend David Sinclair came along and started to talk about a theory of aging again. He called it the information theory of aging. And honestly, this is one of the, David and I have a lot in common, but there are some ways in which we are poles apart in terms of our whole way of doing things. And this is one of those things where I just don't pretend to understand why he chose to use that language. So I'll stop there.
Yuri?
All right. Well, I think aging is programmed. I think aging is an adaptation, and I think it's epigenetics, actually the key driver of aging.
Whoa! I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah, there you go. They wanted a debate. Let's give them a debate. I don't think it's extremely important to figure out, is it a purposeful program, is it an accidental program, and I think it's a continuation of development, and there's a lot of people who think that, and yet they think it's an accidental continuation of development. Mikhail Bogosklonny was one of the proponents of this, following in the footsteps of his father, Vladimir Dilman. But not to get into the history too much, I think at this point there's a lot of evidence to the epigenetic role in being, I think, a driver of aging. Some people say it's the most important hallmark, and yet David Sinclair thinks it's information driving things. I think it's really just a continuation of development. It's actually not that we are losing information as David thinks. I think it's actually our body is continuing the developmental process, and at some point it just continues it in the detrimental direction. Basically, as an opening statement, I think this is enough, and then we can get into the details and the evidence.
So to summarize, Yuri believes, and correct me if I'm wrong, that is basically in the strong theory of aging camp. Mostly that it's programmed and aging, and the program is mostly related to epigenetic changes. Is that right? Yeah.
Or driven by it.
Okay,
I think it's we know lifespan is definitely an adaptation. It's encoded in the genes, but somehow we think that it's accidentally encoded in the genes, and somehow that we're just withholding repair, or evolution is withholding repair for some species, but not other species. And the diversity of aging that we see, from mere days in insects to hundreds of years in whales and so forth, it's somehow an accident of evolution. But I think it's actually driven, and it's an adaptation that is purposefully designed for a particular ecological niche.
Yeah. Okay. And to clarify, Aubrey, you believe more in the weak theories of aging. It's damage, essentially accumulated damage through different mechanisms stochastically, not programmed.
So the weak versus strong thing is actually different from the distinction that Yuri and I are making. So the weak versus strong thing is simply about whether there is one mechanism of aging that dominates or not. Whereas what Yuri is talking about is the question of whether one or many, whether or not weak or strong, in other words, exists for some kind of evolutionary reason. So this idea, which is often called the program theory of aging, is, comes in many forms. There are many theories for what the evolutionary benefit of aging might be. One of the most prominent ones is something called evolvability. It says basically that if you age, then you get rid of the older organisms faster, and therefore you increase the signal-to-noise ratio of natural selection, essentially, is what it comes down to. You end up being able to adapt to changing environmental and ecological conditions more nimbly than you otherwise could. And of course, this makes sense qualitatively. Nobody would really argue about that. The big question is whether it makes sense quantitatively, whether the incremental improvement in nimbleness is enough to justify killing organisms off. And this is where, data, in my view, are decidedly in favor of the idea that aging is, in fact, simply an absence of selective pressure to develop better anti-aging machinery, as opposed to the presence of machinery of selection to say we should not do so. That's basically my take on this. And a lot of this comes down to what I call the cancelling out argument. It says that basically, we definitely have an awful lot of machinery that slows down our aging. There is loads of machinery in the body that, gets rid of waste products and, gets rid of senescent cells and so on. And it works fairly well. So if aging were good for us, if we had genes whose selected reason for existing, whose reason for being maintained during evolution was to cause us to get sick at an earlier age than we would if those genes were absent, then they would be acting against genes that work all the time to stop us from aging. And therefore, what would happen is simultaneous mutations, progressive loss of function in both sides of that argument, both sides of that conflict, which would end up with the pro-aging genes mutating into oblivion while the other genes just became slightly less effective.
Yuri, you want to respond to that?
Well, I mean, the evolutionary reasons for why aging might be programmed, I find, this is more of conjecture and trying to explain why evolution would settle on a particular route of things rather than I just look at it from the empirical side of things, and I see there's just so many different species who are certainly programmed to die. Like mostly insects and plants exhibit these types of species. And so to me, when we say that mammals, for example, what we see is kind of gradual decline in aging cannot be programmed, whereas we see so many examples in other species, I think that's not correct to think that it could not be programmed because evolution would have kind of weeded it out. And I see evidence that evolution just doesn't, in some cases, doesn't extend lifespan in so many different closely related species as evidence that it just doesn't want to, right? It's just not evolutionary beneficial for species to live longer than a particular optimum for their ecological niche. We have my favorite example, rockfishes, right? They vary in lifespan from 12 years to 200 years. They're very closely related. And obviously, to me, if there was some particular mechanisms that could give those 12 fish that live 12 years the capability of living to 200, and those fish just didn't evolve that because of some accident rather than like some sort of actual selective pressure that keeps their lifespan low. I think that that argument just does not hold water.
It's a very important data point that we see such variation in lifespan in species that are quite closely related. And what that certainly says is that it is rather easy to evolve longer lifespans, starting from a short lifespan situation. So one must ask that. So if one looks at that phenomenon in the context of the question whether aging is programmed, then one can look at it in multiple ways. One can say, well, okay, from the point of view of aging is not programmed, one can say, well, okay, for whatever reason, the ecological niche changed so that there was less predation or less infection or something like that, so that the species ended up with a set point that was older, and it was a slower aging situation. From a programmed aging perspective, one could say, well, the reason to die was diminished, right? So one doesn't really answer the question, because if one has to have some kind of reason to die, then that is, again, something that's going to be modulated. It's going to be quantitative in some way, whatever that reason might be, right? So it doesn't really help us. You know, the fact that we see variations between closely related species doesn't really tell us whether aging is programmed or not. We have to look for something else.
Agree? Disagree? Yuri?
Well, I think, yeah, this is just one data point. Other data points point to me to maybe sexual development as being kind of the trigger to aging beginning, and also there are species that can pause this development, and this actually extends their lifespan, including in mammals. My favorite example is Montane Vole, that if it pauses its sexual development, because if it's born in the spring, they only live for about a year, and if it's born in the spring, it actually sexually matures within the same season and dies within the same year. But if they're born in the fall, they actually pause their development until the next spring, and it greatly extends their lifespan. And to me, this kind of ability to live longer that the body somehow withholds from the organism says that basically evolution is not trying to maximize lifespan. It's withholding it in some situations. And caloric restriction is another data point to me that kind of speaks to that it's reserving some capability of living longer for harsh conditions where you're actually trying to, at least for species that need that, like mice.
Right, so this is a really important feature. Thank you, Yuri, for mentioning it. So the fact is that there's a wide variety of environmental circumstances that influence the genome of any species. So if we're specifically talking about aging, there's a wide variety of different environmental circumstances that determine how rapidly an individual should age. But, of course, every individual of a species has more or less the same genome. So that genome has to be versatile. It has to be able to accommodate this wide variety of different circumstances, whether it's in a situation of famine versus abundance of food, whether it's something to do with the division of labor among individuals of the species, like queen bees versus worker bees, everything like that. So we expect to see that some individuals within a species will age faster than others, simply because they are part of the species and they're in a situation where faster aging makes sense. Like when there's a lot of food, it makes sense to eat a lot, even if it's bad for your maximum lifespan, because it's good for your rapidity of reaching sexual maturity and having offspring and passing on your genes. Little things like that. You know, there's all manner of things like that. the reason why calorie restriction works so much less well in long-lived species than in short-lived species is bleeding obvious. It's simply the fact that long famines don't happen as frequently as short famines. That's all you need. That's the only data point you need to explain that phenomenon. And yet it was swept under the carpet for decades.
Right, but doesn't that at least in some point prove that evolution doesn't try to maximize your lifespan?
Oh, no, not at all. Because the point is that evolution tries to maximize your maximum lifespan, in other words, your lifespan in the right conditions, because the variety of environmental circumstances that may be frequent enough to justify having machinery to optimize for is still different from one species to the next. You know, if two species have the same environment at the level of famine, but they have different environments at the level of predation, because one is higher up the food chain than the other, then they're going to evolve different lifespans, even if they have the same variation in those lifespans arising from calorie restriction, for example.
Well, another example that I like is monarch butterflies. They have an order of magnitude difference depending on the season in which they're born.
Sure.
In the summer, they only live 1 month, but in the fall, they actually have to travel down to Mexico, get pregnant there, travel back, so they live 9 months. And at least in that case, it seems to me that it's not a case of somehow suboptimal lifespan, but actually withholding lifespan for the summer species.
But what are they doing with that energy that they save by not maintaining their bodies? They're reproducing, right? It's exactly the same for fruit flies, it's exactly the same for all manner of organisms. Absolutely, there is a trade-off between reproduction and maintenance. They both require energy, they both require a whole bunch of stuff, and therefore it makes sense to be able to switch, to modulate, to have a rheostat between one and the other. We see this all over the place. Let me come back to something you mentioned 5 minutes ago, which was things that are definitely programmed death, like seminal parity in salmon, for example. You know, this is clearly a programmed aging thing, insofar as we can define aging and death to be synonymous for this purpose. But wait, hang on. The fact is, if we look through the tree of life, we do not see any semoparous species that has survived for very long. It's just the same as polyploidy. It just so happens that there's a coincidence with salmon. Salmon are pentaploid. They have 5 copies of their chromosomes. That happens periodically during evolution, and those species tend to survive for only, 1 million years or so. Not very long. It's the same with seminal parity. We do not see this as a long-term successful evolutionary strategy.
Well, what about insects and plants? I think most of them are.
Well, so we don't see seminal
parity.
parity there. So the insects and plants, let's talk about insects, because I know a little bit more about those, and also because they're a little bit closer to us, right? So everything you just cited is complete evidence that there is benefit to having a huge ability to vary how rapidly you age without even changing the genome, just within a species, right? Like worker bees versus queen bees, anything like that, right? But that says nothing at all about whether aging is programmed, because it's in the same species, it's the same genome. It just says different individuals within the species are playing different roles and have different priorities.
Right, but they have the mechanisms for this extreme longevity encoded in the genome, but they're withheld from like worker bees or worker ants, and actually there's parasites that take advantage of that. They infect worker ants and actually make them live as long as queens, and there's no trade-off. They don't need to reproduce, and they can still live. And queens, by the way, I think they contradict this trade-off between reproduction and maintenance or longevity. Queens reproduce like crazy, and they live the longest. And, and yet.
So they reproduce like crazy, but they do so with the help of the workers. So, I mean, absolutely, there is a programmed ability to reduce lifespan, to accelerate aging by, to accelerate aging as a side effect of doing other stuff, working. In fact, that's why worker bees are called workers. But nobody's been able to make queen bees live 10 times as long or 3 times as long as they normally do. The point is there's a maximum that's available from that genome. You can shorten that maximum, but you can't lengthen it.
Wow. I don't know if anybody actually tried to maximize queen bee's lifespan. But
let me talk about an example here. So something came up the other day, yesterday, in fact. So when Martin was up here, one thing he mentioned, which many of you may not know about, is that an impetus grant was given to a guy named who is trying to make worms live for a year. So nematode worms, C. elegans, normally live for about 3 weeks, and a huge contribution to this field was made in 1993 by Cynthia Kenyon, who made them live twice as long. Actually, the first time this was done was 5 years earlier by someone who'd almost forgotten in this field named Tom Johnson, who did basically the same thing. But it was so counter to the field's dogma at the time that everybody said, even though he's a respected researcher, he must be wrong. So they basically just ignored him. And it took until somebody else came along who, perhaps was a bit more charismatic, but the main thing was she was not first. She was the second person to do it. It was replication. And here we are. Now, what did this actually tell us? It's very good that Cynthia's result attracted a lot of talent to the field. But it's very bad that it attracted it too narrowly, because it was already known that the gene that was mutated by Cynthia and the gene that was mutated by Tom Johnson 5 years earlier were genes involved in what's called the Dower pathway, a pathway that allows worms to live 5 times longer, at least, than they normally do when they don't have enough food. Now, it only works if the famine happens at the right time in the nematode's life cycle. But that's fine, because at any point, some nematodes in a population of nematodes are going to be at that right time. Fine so far. Thing is, though, everybody ignored it, because the Dower pathway involves a morphological change in which the worm goes into this spore state where it doesn't eat at all. And so everybody said, well, okay, that's not really calorie restriction, it's just this bizarre thing that worms do. But that's bullshit. Of course it's calorie restriction. The fact that it has a morphological alteration associated with it does not make it not calorie restriction. The only reason Cynthia got all this attention, and Tom as well, is because they found a way to do the life extension part, or at least some of it, most of it, without the morphological change. Fantastic, but it doesn't actually tell us anything about theories of aging. It doesn't tell us anything about what we could do over and above what famine can do. So I've been saying, so this guy was Julian Apple, Helpful? Yeah. He wants to extend lifespan to a year. Great. But we still don't know how long DAOs can stay and be woken up. That experiment has not been done properly. It's been done in a very preliminary, inadequate way. And that's all.
Yeah, well, to my knowledge, the Dower stage, they went up to like 6 months, after which they could still actually like develop into adult form and survive, and beyond 6 months they couldn't.
So yes, so this has been done. Actually, I think it was a little less than that. I think it was like 3 or 4 months. But the point is that they found out when they did that experiment, and this was decades ago, this was 20 years ago at least that this experiment was done, that when you woke these worms up, their remaining lifespan was just as long as it had been if you hadn't put them into DAO in the first place. And that's huge. That's really important, because what it means is that they hadn't actually aged. That the reason why they couldn't be woken up if you left them in DAO for an additional month was not because they were too old. It was because they'd starved to death. That's the only interpretation. And that tells me that the real thing that's wrong with this experiment is that before these larvae went into DAO, they were fed badly. There's a huge problem with C. elegans experiments in lifespan, which is grossly neglected, which is that too many things work. It's pretty much, you can knock out any gene in a nematode and it'll live longer. I mean, it's not quite that bad, but it's nearly that bad. Literally, it's a couple of hundred genes you can knock out, and they will live longer out of the 20,000 genes that they have. What? You can knock out their oxphos, and they'll live longer. I mean, Jesus Christ. So, the only interpretation of that is that our controls are being poisoned. That, we're giving these worms stuff to live on that is shortening their life. And when we get these knockouts that give life extension, it's happening because they are doing less metabolism. They are taking up the poison less well. It's that bad. It's that bad.
That's an interesting perspective.
It's worse than that. It's worse. I'm not done. Like people have shown this. You can give these bacteria, you can give these worms, normally you give these worms bacteria to eat, right? These worms grew up, they evolved in the soil. Do we give them bacteria from the soil, Rhodobacter or whatever? Not as such. We give them E. coli from our butts. What the hell do you expect, right? And it turns out that all you need to do is lethally irradiate these bacteria before you give them to the nematodes, and the nematodes live longer, but with dead bacteria than they do with live bacteria. Honestly, I have no words. Honestly, so if you were to do this experiment that we're just talking about, seeing how long DAOs can live before they can't be woken up, right? Obviously, you've got to do it with, medium that isn't poisoning before you even, right?
Okay.
Well, just a couple of words on nematodes and making them live for a year. To my knowledge, this has been done by Robert Schmuckler-Rees.
No, he got 6 months. What he did was he knocked out H1, which is what Tom Johnson did, and then he did this in this very clever way to do it through 2 generations so that the H1 protein was really, really depleted. And sure enough, that got a 10-fold increase. But 10 times 3 weeks is not a year.
I think, to my knowledge, there's some unpublished 20 times increase that went to a year.
I haven't heard that.
But also, I think the maximum lifespan in that, because that 200 days was median lifespan in that 10 times increase, but maximum lifespan kind of hovering around 300. But
I don't think he ever got any worm to live more than 8 months. But I could be wrong.
Yeah, but they haven't yet gotten to a year. as well.
That's
Have they?
my understanding.
Or-
My understanding is that Upfell is still trying this, and I only found out about this work literally last week. So I will be giving
There were some
Upfell
tweets or something.
Yeah, there's a
advice.
I think Lada Ninza from Impetus Grants had tweeted something about
That's right.
unpublished data, perhaps that these worms are living over a year,
Oh, they already have-
24x increase in
Oh, okay.
lifespan. Yeah, you guys can check that out. But
Let's wait until
yeah.
the publication.
One thing I will definitely want to be looking at is whether low temperature was involved.
Yeah,
because that's a cheat.
yeah,
Because it's known to extend both worms and fruit flies, and it's kind of been used as
yeah.
kind of
I think the grant was basically trying to try multiple combinations of things that extend lifespan in C. elegans and then put them all together. It's kind of like robust C. elegans rejuvenation, maybe. Okay, so I want to wrap this up and then allow the audience maybe to give one or two questions. But okay, so let's bring this back to reality and instead of all just theory. So how do we resolve this? Or does this? I mean, maybe a bad time to bring this up. This question, but does this even matter? Why would the organizers even talk about this? And then, like, maybe in that segue, like, how does this affect, like, practically, like, what sort of interventions we should develop, and research that we should, prioritize? Like, what's your take?
So I have a kind of intermediate position. I think that it's important to have some theory of what the hell is going on in our bodies that is eventually bad for us in order to guide us to what might stop that from happening. But I think it's absolutely critical not to be seduced by that line of thinking. I think it's absolutely critical to keep at the front of our minds the realization, the acknowledgement that we only need to know so much in order to get to a point of developing things that work. So so theories of aging have their place, but they are not the be-all and end-all of what we do.
Yeah, I think it matters to some degree. On the kind of in the grand scheme of things, it's great that different people have different views and are trying different approaches because it's just hedging our bets. Because somebody might be wrong, somebody might be right. But if program aging is the correct hypothesis, then we could be kind of working on a lot of dead ends, and some approaches just never going to work. Like even replacement might not work because if your brain is controlling your aging and you put old brain in a new body, the old brain will just quickly tell the new body that it's as old as the old body was. And so in that sense, this is a question that I think it matters. And conversely, if it actually turns out that we can actually somehow capture the mechanisms of signaling mechanism of just the whatever exosomes in your blood or excretions from your hypothalamus from the young body telling the old body that it's young again and basically trying to convince it to behave in a new way. This could be a kind of easier way to get the rejuvenation that we're seeking without needing to replace or completely clear the damage by ourselves, but let the body take care of it as it does when we're younger. So from that standpoint, it could matter. But ultimately, for the field, while it's great to debate and eventually, of course, it'd be great to figure out how exactly aging works, I think for the field at large, it's still okay to not have this complete understanding.
Yeah, totally. And coming back to replacement, which Yuri brought up, this hasn't come up in this conversation yet. I just want to say 100% that, there's work going on right now. Chris Borer spoke about this a couple of weeks ago at LBF. I don't know whether it's coming up over the next week or two. The experiment that needs to be done of heterochronic whole body transplantation is absolutely critical. That is the way in which we will find out the extent to which the brain is actually rejuvenated by the rest of the body when the rest of the body, when given not just the circulation as we have with heterochronic parabiosis, but much more than the circulation. And of course, there's huge barriers to that in terms of making sure that the surgery actually doesn't introduce its own damage that counteracts the benefits. But I really want to see that done.
Fantastic.
Well, we're in agreement.
Okay, so let's get some audience questions in here. Okay.
Hey, thanks for everything. I'm not sure how to phrase this, but is there any truth or evidence to suggest that perhaps some communities believe that male orgasms may reduce lifespan or shorten health span?
Some of the most long-standing conflicts with regard to what works and what doesn't work, what's good and what's bad in aging, revolve around enjoyable things. So there's a huge constituency that says that sex is good for your aging, and there's another huge constituency that says that sex is bad. Similarly, there's a huge constituency that says that alcohol consumption is good for aging, and a huge constituency that says it's bad. Honestly, that's all I have to say. Your mileage may vary.
So I have a question that's more of a comment and supporting Yuri's position. First of all, I want to say if aging is programmed, that's a good thing because you can reprogram it. And the other thing is with respect to, now I'm losing my train of thought, but yeah, development. So it's hard to think of how evolution has an effect after you've already reproduced because it's a very weak effect. The genes are selected for fitness, for reproduction. But in terms of development, you can think of evolutionary selection for either rapid or slow development. And if aging's a consequence of that, then this is how you can have programs for longer, shorter life. And you see epigenetic aging starts not after reproduction, but it starts in the embryo.
Yeah, absolutely. The epigenetic clock, it starts ticking. I mean, there's ground zero during gastrulation, as I've alluded to yesterday, according at least to some research. And epigenetic clock, it continues ticking after development. During development, it ticks an exponential rate, and after development stops, the rate slows down considerably, like it becomes linear ticking of the epigenetic clock. And it seems that duration of development is actually somehow tightly coupled to overall lifespan. There's approximately like 10% of our life history, in mammals at least, is spent on development, and the rest of the lifespan. And there's definitely strong disparity in reproductive duration between males and females, in males at least, in mammals at least. And while humans are one of the only species that have menopause, along with like whales and some others, but the actual cessation of reproduction in females is actually a rather common trait. Despite, I mean, there's some argument just how common, because the estrus cycle is actually stopped in a lot of species prematurely. So post-reproductive female's lifespan is actually, like a long post-reproductive female's lifespan is a trait of many mammalian species. So it seems that there is a lot of programmed nature even to the reproductive senescence and cessation of reproduction in mammals at least. And so yeah, I mean, to me, it's all a coordinated process, and I just can't see evolution being very tightly controlling the duration of gestation, time to sexual maturity, and all the different stages, and then kind of just letting go and throwing its hands and like, okay, I won't care about how long you live, and you guys reproduce on your own, and I won't like control how long you get to reproduce, because that could also be like it's a vicious cycle, like cessation of reproduction. But the cessation of reproduction happens because the body somehow ages and is no longer able to reproduce. So if evolution on an individual level has all the incentive to keep you reproducing for as long as possible, because the more progeny in the later stages of your life you can produce, the more evolutionary input you get to the gene pool. So.
There's a key thing here that I think needs to be emphasized, which is often overlooked. So many people, and I was guilty of this myself for a long time, say, well, it would be terribly wonderful if aging were programmed, because it's much easier to break something in biology than it is to build something. And therefore, we could live longer just by breaking the program. But that turns out to be an oversimplification. And this was first pointed out by Josh Mitteldorf, one of the best thinkers in the programmed aging thing. He said, well, wait, the thing is that if aging were programmed and it's just simply programmed, in other words, it's easy to break, then that breaking would happen spontaneously quite often during evolution. We would get cheetahs, right? And that would fuck everything up. The species would be taken over by these cheetahs before the species benefited from having the programmed aging, which is supposed to be a rare thing, when you go through some bottleneck of one sort or another. Therefore, Josh points out that any program for aging must be an extremely redundant one that is very, 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 very hard to break down by spontaneous mutations. And that means that it would also be very, very hard to break down by us. So actually, the logic that we wish aging were programmed doesn't work.
Right. Well, yeah. There's no guarantee that if it is programmed, it'd be an easy program to break.
In fact, there's a guarantee that it will not be, because otherwise it would be broken spontaneously.
Maybe a small counterpoint to that is that during artificial selection, it's actually quite easy on evolutionary scales to extend lifespan. For example, in fruit flies, because it's been like over 7 times increase in lifespan over like 20 years of experiments.
But that was by evolution, so many genes at the same time being co-evolved.
Yeah, well, artificial in a lab, yeah, but it's still not impossible. And yeah, definitely evolution probably has a much easier time experimenting than we do in the lab, because it's just orders of magnitude more variation.
I was just trying to say the point of action of evolution is it's working on the speed of development. And as far as breaking the program, who would have guessed 4 transcription factors would break the program?
Well, actually, I would. I think, if we look in hindsight, we must ask ourselves, how surprising was that?
To me, it was very surprising.
It should not have been. It should not have been. Because if we look at the way that development works, it is like that. There are master control genes that determine, that orchestrate, that originate a cascade, a fanning out cascade of other stuff. We should have expected that there would be master control genes that determined the resetting of 2 very different, very specialist genomes, the sperm genome and the oocyte genome, into a zero-age state. We should have expected that.
Well, I didn't. Sorry.
And I think that's why John Gurdon got the Nobel Prize along Shinya Yamanaka, because that's
right.
what his experiment in the 60s essentially hinted at. So it's just, unfortunately, took us too long to narrow down the actual factors that do this, because I guess at that time biology was just not as advanced, and our toolkit was not as advanced to poke at the transcription factors, or even know that there are transcription factors.
Hello, my name is Byron. I'm a biologist here and a resident, so it's pretty awesome experiencing this. I'm kind of a newbie scientist. I have a question about transgenerational epigenetics, and if aging is passed down, maybe similar to Lamarckism or anything along those lines, if that's any research, or am I just completely off base on that?
So not completely, but very nearly completely.
It's a learning.
Of course, what we see in transgenerational transmission of stuff is that we know what the genome is, we know that it gets basically reset, but we know that resetting is not 100% complete. There's this thing called imprinting, where certain genes are turned on only from the mother or only from the father. It's a very weird thing that only happens to a small minority of genes, but it happens. And a lot of that is still very much a research area. Then there's everything else in the cell other than the DNA, in the fertilized egg, other than the DNA. Now, that comes from mostly the mother. it's perfectly possible that there's some stuff in there whose composition is determined by what happened in the mother, right? We cannot completely exclude that. At this point, I think the balance of opinion would be that whatever contributions there are that are not genetic are rounding error. You know, they don't really make much of a difference. But that is that is the strongest I would go to. I wouldn't say it's definitely there's no difference.
When does it end?
Wait, one last question.
All right, thank you. So I wonder what each of your thoughts might be on the possibility that there might be programmed aging, but for simpler or relatively simpler organisms, the butterflies that were given as an example, and humans might have already escaped that kind of programmed aging as such because we don't have a lot of predators, again, relative to other animals. We have a slower developmental cycle, so it would be to our evolutionary advantage to live longer than, say, a butterfly or a mouse that has to reproduce very quickly, or else it'll get eaten before it can reproduce. So could it be that we've escaped the program and the kind of aging that affects us is more the damage accumulation that evolution doesn't care about?
I guess I'll take a first crack at it. I mean, it's plausible, but when I look at kind of the evolutionary conserved mechanisms of aging between like a mouse and a human, I see kind of the same pattern of life history, or humans and rats, including, again, like reproductive senescence in females. And I think it's the same life history that we have in humans as essentially in mice, except it's just extended so much more, starting from gestation and then time to sexual maturity. And I think, and of course we have the example of whales, of where we can actually take, even with this current program, where we can take it to like 200 years, that we can comfortably live, and at least like the biophysics of our composition of our mammalian bodies allow for that, we can strive to, even within just the confines of the program, finding ways to extend this lifespan to that limit. So
yeah, let me give a mathematical answer. So there is a concept in population genetics called population viscosity, which is all essentially about the extent to which you are likely to breed with individuals that are closely related to you. This typically revolves around, simply relative, whether you have legs, things like that. And it turns out that makes a difference, because the concept of programmed aging has historically been assumed to revolve around something called group selection, which is kind of known to not work mathematically. But there's something that's very similar to group selection called kin selection, which is essentially what I just said. That so there was a famous British biologist in the 1930s named J.B.S. Haldane who said that he would gladly lay down his life for one sibling or 8 second cousins. And this was essentially a description of group selection, of kin selection. So basically, viscosity matters. If individuals don't move very much during their life, then they are more likely to breed with close relatives, and that makes programmed aging more attractive evolutionarily. So when we look at what we see in programmed aging, like salmon, or there are even mammals, there's a marsupial in Australia that does this, we can see that it could make sense from an evolutionary perspective, simply because the offspring of the salmon will benefit, in fitness terms, from being able to have the nutrients from the disintegration of their mother, basically, from the physical disintegration of their mother. And, the reason why this doesn't work for a long time during evolutionary history it's probably because ecological situations change and population viscosity reduces to a level where it doesn't sustain the selective pressure.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have for questions. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists, our debaters. It was very, very contentious. Okay, so.